and the title of my talk today is called We Are Made of Stories. And when I first did the research into this topic, I Googled that expression just to make sure I wasn't plagiarizing someone. I thought, wow, such a clever title, you know, I was proud of myself. And I thought certainly someone has come up with this before. And there were a few, unfortunately, references to it. So it isn't original with me, but it in this form, I think I've never seen anybody doing it. So I was like, good, I can speak about this for myself. And so as I was typing "We Are Made of Stories" into Google, you know how she suggests things as you type, right? Like we are made, and then already Google is telling you what she thinks you might be looking for. And so I was really intrigued because the first one was we are made of stardust or star stuff, and then the second one was stardust. And I thought even Google's losing her faith. You know, it's like even Google doesn't know what she's made of. You know. And then the third one was we are made in the image of God, and the fourth one was we're made of meat, which was much less inspiring. I thought. I thought, yeah, it's not as nearly as poetic. So I thought, yeah, we're made of stardust and or star stuff, as Carl Sagan said, and as Lawrence Krauss has reminded us more recently. And it's an inspiring idea to me, actually, a post-theistic kind of inspiring idea that we're made of all the same stuff that everything we can see with our eyes and things that we can't see with our eyes are made of. We're made of this material of dead stars from billions of years ago. We're made of atoms, 7 billion atoms. But we're also made of stories. I mean, as I think about science and what science tells us and teaches us, it's incredibly inspiring, and I'm sort of rediscovering science since college. I was the last actual science education I did. But as I was trained in the liberal arts, and so as I explore science, there's this liberal arts part of me, that's sort of like, there's got to be more than just atoms. What happens when we put all those atoms together into a human being? It's more than just the sum of its parts. And this is where I think it's important to remember that we're made of stories. We live by and live into stories. All the events of our lives, every experience that we've ever had, both happy and sad, both wonderful and tragic, have made us the people that we are today, for better or for worse. And I think when I was inside religion, there was a lot of sort of guilt about the bad stuff and sort of excitement about the good stuff. And I find it much easier now to simply say, this is who I am. The bad things, the good things, all together, they just make me the person I am today. And that's just who I am. And I'm grateful for all of those experiences. Every person we've ever loved, every conversation we've ever engaged in, every place we've ever visited, every song we've ever listened to, every book we've ever read, all is a part of us. It makes us who we are as unique individuals. And it connects us to other people who have had other experiences. And as we share our experiences, our stories with one another, we create relationships, which is another part of our story. And then together, these little stories of our lives create narratives. Narratives are what I think of as like super stories. Narratives are stories that describe groups of people's experience in a kind of generic way. They give form and structure to our existence. They tell us how to act, how to respond, what to believe. And we really, again, can't live without these stories shaping our lives. Sometimes we call them culture. Narratives are like culture. They form us inside of a system, a cohesive system of acting and responding. When someone sticks their hand out to you like this, you don't have to think, my goodness, why is that person thrusting their hand towards me? What shall I do with it? We just instinctively put your hand out to shake their hand because we know that that's a part of a story that we share together. This is how we greet one another. Or we slap each other on the back 3 times, like gently, so as not to injure the person. But this is another way of, we're familiar with kind of when someone walks towards you and opens their arms, you're not thinking, oh my God, is he going to tackle me? You're thinking, oh, he's reaching in for a hug, and you may or may not like that, but we know what that's about. It's kind of these stories give shape to how we live our lives. Take, for example, a much bigger story, a story that we should all be fairly familiar with. It's called the American Dream. This narrative of the American Dream is a powerful story. It tells us who we are or who we ought to be, where we came from, and where we're going. It almost is like a religious story, isn't it? It answers or attempts to answer some of those same kind of basic questions. It tells you what you should be aiming for with your life, what you should be dreaming about, and how you should get there. And there are little stories inside of the big narrative of the American dream that are like examples of, Sam, who made well of his life. He tried really hard, and he bought a house and sent his kids to college and then retired and traveled the United States and maybe the world and enjoyed his retirement years. I mean, these are the examples, the little stories that all together, these little stories make this big story called the American dream. We even capitalize the A and the D just to make sure we know that this is a big story, right? This is a narrative that we're all supposed to be part of. And these narratives hold us in a way, like a gravitational force. They hold us in orbit around the central values and ideas that that narrative teaches us. And this can be good. It holds us in shape. It gives us some structure to our lives, helps us know how to act. It enables us to do things in the world without having to analyze and think about every little thing. So without this structure, we would be consumed by minutia. But these narratives also hold us back. They limit us, they restrict us, and they limit our ability to see other possibilities, to accept other narratives that other people may be living by. They can cause conflict between people that are living by different narratives. You may even think that someone that's living by a different narrative is crazy or irrational or stupid, and they might think the same of you. So what are some of these narratives? What are we actually talking about? So when I was going through my year without God, I started thinking about what are the big stories that we latch onto as people, that we live out of and into. And there are only a finite number of them, and they almost always have to do with meaning and purpose. Stories that describe how we're meaningful and purposeful people and what we should do with our lives in meaningful and purposeful ways. And also this interesting little word, salvation, which if you grew up in the church or in any religion, salvation is kind of this loaded word, but it's also an ordinary noun that we might use. You might use more commonly the word save rather than salvation. It's kind of religious-y kind of, use of the word. But these narratives that I'm going to quickly run through, about 4 of them, many cases are about salvation. So the first one that we are familiar with is the religious narrative. And I start there because it's the one that I spent the last 2 years sort of undoing in my life, or that it sort of undid me in a way. So the religious narrative tells us that we're made in God's image and that our purpose is to give honor and glory to God. And in the end, God will save us for eternity. He will save our lives. Even though we may suffer now, we will have peace and prosperity later. And many of us in this room have spent a lot of time inside the orbit of that narrative. And it's easy to see how that narrative is about meaning and purpose and salvation. Even though you disagree with it perhaps, it's still a story about meaning and purpose that a lot of people, right, still live very closely to. But there are these 3 other big narratives. And the next one that I encountered as I sort of left the religious narrative, and I'll talk more about how that happened in a minute, the next narrative that was waiting to greet me was the scientific narrative, the narrative about science and technology. So in this story, science answers the big questions about our existence and about our purpose if we have one, where we came from, where we can expect to be in the future, and how we can be saved, right? Science can literally save you. How many of you have been saved by science? Have you had a surgery that saved your life, or prescription medication that makes you, me too. So science has literally a salvific role in our lives. We turn to it to extend our lives, to make us live longer, to make us live a higher quality of life, to save us from an illness that would have killed our grandparents. We can easily survive it. Technology is making us, in some ways, superhuman, right? I got a new iPhone. I feel a little superhuman. I think when I get the Apple Watch, I'll feel even more superhuman. I'm really excited. But that's only, partly a joke, right? Like these wearables and replacement body parts. Some of you may even have replacement body parts inside of you right now that are created by science to extend your life. And more scientists are projecting that they can extend our lives much further through technology. So this is an interesting story. It's a meta story about where we came from, where we're going, how we get there, how do we make meaning out of it, and how we can ultimately live forever, maybe. I don't know. I don't think there are very many scientists saying we're going to live forever, but there's an aspiration, right? People want to live longer, at least, if not forever. Then there's the capitalist narrative. This is where we usually start stepping on people's toes. This is an economic story about how we live the good life, right? That if we work hard and if we apply ourselves and we innovate and we use good economic principles, we can make more money. And as the theory goes, that money is shared with our employees who also make money, and then they can take care of their families. And in a way, this economic narrative is designed to save us from poverty, to save us from starvation, to save us from obscurity. And we don't have time to go into all of the ways that this operates in our lives. It's not all bad. It's not all good. It's just a story that is waiting in the wings when we are looking for stories to say, this is the story that will help you live a better, good, prosperous life. And then there's the nationalist narrative, and we're here gathered in the United States of America, and that's the country that I'm most familiar with. And this story also tells us what our value is, what it means to have purpose and meaning, and this gives us this idea that America will save us, that when we're really in danger, the government will protect us from foreign enemies, from domestic enemies. And indeed, this is true. It would be interesting to know, probably terrifying to know, how many near misses were averted by people behind the scenes, like making sure terrorist attacks don't happen or making sure that other bad things don't happen. There's a whole system at work to protect us, to keep us safe, and to keep us moving towards this, to mix the stories, our prosperous economic story that we are all a part of. It's not just designed to save us, also the American story, or the nationalist story of America, is also designed to save the whole world, which also resonates with me as a Christian. I heard stories about saving the whole world. Here's a quote for you, and we'll play a little game, see if you can name the author of this quote. "We will persistently clarify the choice before every ruler and every nation, the moral choice between oppression, which is always wrong, and freedom, which is eternally right." Notice, eternally right. "As hope kindles hope, millions more will find it. By our efforts, we will have lit a fire as well, a fire in the minds of men. It warms those who feel its power. It burns those who fight its progress. And one day, this untamed fire of freedom will reach the darkest corners of the world." That's a big story, isn't it? That's a totalizing story about the whole world and how American democratic ideals will save not just us, but everyone. Who do you think was the author of that quote? It doesn't really matter. Jefferson? George W. Bush, second inaugural address. It's inspiring, I mean, it might be a little overreach, but it's inspiring nonetheless. It kind of says, I really appreciate the freedom and the prosperity that I have as an American. Others would be good to have that too. We could have long discussions about if that's truly good, but that's what happens inside of big stories. We have these debates about what is really the good life and how do we achieve it. But notice that all of these narratives assume a need for salvation. We all want to live. We all want to survive. The religious narrative is concerned about ultimate survival, eternal life. But each of us has evolved to survive at all costs. We have a tremendous will to live. And we want to live forever, literally or figuratively. We want to live on. We want to be remembered. Now, these narratives are not bulletproof, as you probably have guessed by now. Some combination of these narratives, and probably others, hold us in orbit, as I said, and it makes a kind of stasis or stability in our lives possible when these narratives are working well. But sometimes these narratives fail us. Sometimes the story doesn't turn out the way we were told it should turn out, or the ending gets screwed up, right? Usually that's what happens. The ending gets screwed up, and we're like, wait, we were supposed to get the house and the family and the retirement. Like, what happened to that? I thought that's what my dad's story told me. My dad taught me that story, right? Work hard, stay with your job. My dad stayed with the same company until he got laid off once, then got another job and retired there. That was how he lived his life. And he's not rich, but he's doing okay. He's going to be fine. It's amazing. Actually, I marvel at it. It's like, wow, it's like almost like a museum piece. You kind of think, whoa, this is how the former generation lived. They had this kind of security if you were white and middle class and educated. So when these stories begin to fail us, as they will do, it gives us an opportunity to enter another orbit. And usually when these stories fail us, I sometimes call this escape velocity, where we can escape the story that's been holding us. And it's sometimes a personal loss. It could be a death in the family. It could be you discover that you have a chronic or disabling disability, a medical condition. It could be economic failure. It could be an economic failure that strikes you personally, or it could be a more systemic, nationwide economic failure where your home is foreclosed, but not just you, but 20 people on your street and 1,000 people in your city. And all of a sudden, we're scratching our heads about this economic story and the American dream, and we're thinking, wait a second, this story isn't perfect, there's something going wrong here. Or it could be a societal crisis like 9/11, which we didn't see coming and we weren't ready for, and suddenly we were scratching our heads going, gosh, I thought America was supposed to protect us. I thought we were impervious to this kind of attack. What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a member of the global society in which this kind of thing happens on a regular basis in places all over the world? So these stories hit road bumps, and when they do, we have an opportunity to think critically about our stories that we necessarily live inside of. What's difficult about narratives or worldviews is that we're blind to them most of the time, right up to the point when we're not. And then we go, oh my gosh, this is the story that I've been told, and it's a lie. Usually something outside of us is required to nudge us or give us that escape velocity, but then we reach that place where we're sort of between stories. And I think it's at that place where many of us find ourselves. We're kind of in between stories. We're not sure who we are or where we are or if we can trust anyone or anything. We're sort of floating between this story tells me I'm going to be safe and secure. This story tells me I could be safe and secure in a different way. I'm feeling pretty unsafe and insecure. And that's kind of the world that we find ourselves in often when we have these escape velocity moments in our lives. In my own case, I could feel, years before it happened, the Christian story running out of gas for me. I felt it personally in my own life. After years of prayer and Bible study, I felt the absence of God so acutely. I had developed a theology about the absence of God, like many theologians have done. I told my congregation that the absence of God was actually the evidence of God's presence. Think about it. No, there's no? Okay. So yeah, but this was the story that, everybody experiences God's absence. If you give everyone some truth serum, and sit them down and say, have you ever experienced the absence of God, the sense of God's absence? Every believer will say, oh yeah, of course, I felt the absence of God. So you create a theology that says that's when you're walking closest with God, right? So, and then after a while, you're like, that's just bullshit, right? It's just the absence of God. I think it's just the feeling of absence that we all feel because we're alone. That's probably what it is, right? So you kind of in the back of my mind, I have this little splinter, we're really alone, right? Oh, no, we can't think about that. So we create a theology about how it's normal and how Jesus felt the same thing in the Garden of Gethsemane right before he did the most ultimate thing on the cross. He felt abandoned by his Father too. So if Jesus felt the absence of God, certainly it's not extraordinary for us. So things like this began to happen. I could also see it institutionally. I could see that the church institutionally was bankrupt, that it was facing a system-wide, not just in the Adventist church, but system-wide, facing a crisis of integrity and morality. And as a pastor, I was paid in some sense to keep the story going, keep this narrative going, and to keep people inside the orbit of it. Even while I myself am on the outside of the orbit, very little gravity is still holding me inside. I was told to drive that car a few more miles, and I wanted to say, guys, we might want to look under the hood here. There's some really bad noises coming from down there, and I feel like we don't want to be in the middle of Utah when the thing breaks down because you're going to die out there, so we should look. But nobody's paying you to ask those kinds of pesky questions or to, draw their attention to the noise that's coming from under the hood. That's not what church structures do. Church structures, much like corporate structures, are designed to present to the public outside a very good picture that everything's okay and that, profits are increasing, market share is increasing, everything's going well. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, everybody's scrambling to make it so, right? You tell a story to the world and then you scramble on the inside to say we got to do whatever the hell we got to do to make sure that's true. right? So that we aren't caught in a lie. And the same thing happens in churches and structures. We sing one more verse of Just As I Am, convince ourselves that God is going to save us in the end, and that nothing truly bad can happen. On a personal level, my relationships were in shambles. My therapist, who if I hadn't been seeing her weekly for the last 4 years of my pastoral ministry, I probably would have fallen completely apart. I used to say I would have had a real breakdown. Then I thought, well, I kind of did have a real breakdown. But at least I had a breakdown in a really constructive way for me. Like I was able to sort of sort through the mess. It's sort of like grief. There's like no shortcut to go through grief. You just have to go through it, and it feels terrible, and you just have to do it. And if you don't do it, you'll end up doing it later. So this kind of, leaving a big story like religion or any other big story, it's painful, and there's really no shortcut through it. You just have to sort of ride it out and do the work, which I think the work is honestly addressing the questions and the challenges that you've been shelving in the back of your mind for a long time. And so that's why I did, a year without God. I wanted to take a year to decide for myself if God was there. And so people always ask me, in fact, someone just accused me last night on Facebook. I got off the plane, checked Facebook, there were like 20 comments on this thing I was tagged in, a bunch of Christians, accusing me of being unethical and all that. And then I made a comment, and then I went to dinner with these guys, and I came back, and there was 180 comments on the thread. And I was like, oh, shit, this is bad. So I sorted through some of it, and it was the same kind of like hand-wringing. But backing up to when I left the church, I finally left my denomination in March of 2013, so just 2 years ago, when my boss and I reached a mutual agreement that I wasn't Seventh-day Adventist anymore. Apparently, I was the last one to find out. I had been manipulating that sucker for a long time to make it fit. And I had a good thing going. I loved my congregation. I didn't want to quit. I didn't want to stop doing what I was doing, but I realized the jig was up. And it was a painful separation, but it was also freeing. And shortly after resigning my position, I said, people said I looked healthier. I had less burden and stress on my face and in my shoulders. And I was given a gift, really, the freedom to step back and say, is any of this worth saving? And that simple question led me to question the Seventh-day Adventist Church's narrative, and then to go a little bit wider and question the Christian narrative, and then to go a little wider than that and question the entire God narrative, and to ask myself, is any of it real? And even if it might be, is any of it important? Because, one of the things that you quickly discover if you're going down this road and exploring, questions about the existence of God is that if, nobody really has proof of anything, and if we did, we wouldn't be talking about it right now. So in the absence of any kind of evidence or proof one way or the other, I came fairly quickly, I would say April, May, to the conclusion that whether or not God existed, it was fairly irrelevant to my life. So I thought, well, yeah, so Christians will sometimes say to me, but you don't know for sure that God doesn't exist. And I said, yeah, of course, I don't know for sure much of anything, really, but I certainly don't know for sure if God exists. So until God shows up and does something, worth noticing, I'm just going to assume that he doesn't, I guess, and live my life. I feel more fulfilled. I feel more focused. I feel more aware of myself and my place in the world. I feel more aware of the world and what my part is in it. And so I just went through that process of just questioning things. And I think the thing I say now more than ever to Christians or people who are on the fence is just not to allow anyone to tell you that a certain question is not to be asked or not okay to ask. That all questions, all intellectual curiosity is healthy to at least begin to explore the kinds of big metaphysical questions that you may have. I also learned that reaching escape velocity on the religious narrative does not mean that I land suddenly in a neutral, objective, narrative-free space where I can see the world as it really is. I hope we can all recognize that there is no one way the world really is. Every narrative will try to tell you that they have the privileged view of the world, the most panoramic, literally this word panoramic, the view of everything, the way the world really, really is. And that's part of the mechanism that narratives use to kind of establish their priority in people's lives and in our social life. So if you reach escape velocity on the God narrative, the scientific narrative is waiting in the wings to say, welcome to reality, which is what a lot of people said to me. And in a sense, science does portray a lot of reality that religion denies or prohibits the inquiry into even. And so there was a huge liberation, like, oh, wow, there's a scientific narrative that I had been just put completely aside in my life that describes a great deal about questions that, like, it's so interesting. Like, people will say on Facebook and Twitter, well, what about near-death experiences? And I'm like, well, here are 6 articles you can read about that describes pretty much what, medical doctors and scientists think happens in a near-death experience. You can read about it and learn about it and keep track of what new scientific discoveries are coming out about that and understand it the best that we can. And I was so relieved by that. I thought, wow, this is really healthy and powerful. At the same time, I hope that as we reach this escape velocity on one narrative, that we would develop a healthy skepticism toward all narratives, toward all attempts to sell you the really real view of life and everything. We should be skeptical about the narratives that are competing for our loyalty, always examining them rather than blindly stumbling from one ideology to another. Our society is going through a crisis, you may have noticed. One of the reasons it feels like we're slipping backwards, I think, into some old behaviors that we thought were behind us. Racism, sexism, xenophobia. I mean, does it feel to you like there's more of that now for some reason? More racism, more violence towards people that are different than us, more homophobia? And my own sort of very armchair sort of analysis of that is that this is what happens when people freak out about the fact that they're losing the dominance of their narrative. There was a narrative that shaped the reality, more or less, of our entire country. And the more different people join us in this big family that we call the United States of America, some of them are Muslim, and some of them are Hindu, and some of them are atheists, and some of them are all sorts of different things. And we now have to share our society with a lot of people that are different than us. And that's hard, like our moms tried to teach us to share when we were little, and we never really learned very well that we had to share things. And now, so politicians, what they do primarily, because they're the ones who represent us, as they see that narrative losing grip in society, they grab on tighter, and they ramp up, they escalate the stakes in that conversation. And so my sense is, and this is happening in the Christian world as well, as more and more people become atheists. There was another great CBS special that aired today featuring Neil Carter. Some of you may read Neil's blog on Pathos. It's called Godless and Dixie, and the black non-believers of Atlanta. Great little profile on some non-believers in the Bible Belt. And what happens when this kind of thing happens is that people feel, they know they're losing power. They know they're losing control of the story that meant so much to them. And fine that it meant so much to them. But now as that begins to erode and wear thin, people grasp on even tighter. They try to enact laws to prevent the narrative from unwinding even more. And people get angry, and people even die. People get shot, when they shouldn't be. And so I think we're entering into a new era. We don't know exactly what it looks like yet. We're starting to enter a period of time in which there's no one cohesive story about what it means to be human. And you might think that's a good thing, and I agree with you that it's a good thing, but it's also still terrifying and unsettling and disorienting, because freedom is frightening, because freedom moves you out of a place of security into a new landscape where all bets are off, and we don't know how the end of the story is going to be written. And so from where will come our story about human dignity, since these other stories are falling apart? Where will come the source of our hope and courage? And I think it has to come from us, from the we. We right here this morning in Phoenix. This is where the next story comes from. Together, we're writing the narrative that our children will live by. And it's up to us, no pressure, but it's up to us to fashion out of we can use a Phoenix metaphor here, out of the dust, out of the rubble of these old narratives, the thing that will emerge, right? The thing that will become the way we choose to be. as human beings in our society. And that's what makes me so excited about Sunday Assembly. It's what makes me excited about humanism in general and this emerging movement of humanists and the gatherings that are happening all over the country, whether it's Sunday Assembly or something else, where people are beginning to say, okay, that narrative about religion isn't working for me anymore. I don't buy it, but there are some remnants there that are good. I kind of like. I think we still need to hang out with one another and support each other and laugh together and cry together. And then there's some elements of this story about capitalism that are probably worth holding on to, and there's some elements of this story that are probably worth holding on to. Let's create a new world together that we can all live in together peacefully. And to me, that's the work of democracy that we have to do together. So that's why I'm kind of where my life is focused now, why I still feel very much like a pastor in some ways, just with a slightly different message. So thank you so much for what you're doing here, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of it today.